Hi everybody! Well, we're not far away from the 2011 Tostitos Fiesta Bowl, and for the fifth time the Oklahoma Sooners will be playing in the Fiesta Bowl as they'll take on the Connecticut Huskies. Yes, the Fiesta Bowl is a major bowl game, but it didn't start off as a major bowl game. Now, just like we did last year when Oklahoma played Stanford in the Sun Bowl, we gave you a brief history story on the Sun Bowl. Well, we're going to keep with tradition as we are going to give you a brief history story on the Fiesta Bowl. But the Fiesta Bowl, unlike its major bowl competition like the Rose, the Sugar, the Orange, and when it was a major bowl, the Cotton Bowl, the Fiesta Bowl, its infancy could not be traced to the black and white television era or the leather football era as far as the leather helmets go. No, it's more contemporary than that. You have to go back to the late 1960s. Now, the Western Athletic Conference has a lot to do with the Fiesta Bowl, as you're going to find out in just a few minutes. The WAC, in the late 60s, its champions, Wyoming in 1968, Arizona in 1969, respectively, were left out of being selected for a bowl. You have to remember that college football in that era is not like today, where in today's era 70 teams go to bowl games. It's 35 bowls. There were not 35 bowls back in the late 60s, not even close. So it was possible to have a real good year, or in the case of the WAC, to win your conference and still not even be considered for a bowl bid. That's what happened to the WAC in 68 and 69. Obviously, this did not make the Western Athletic Conference happy, and kind of under the table, you know, kind of behind closed doors, there was discussion about having a particular bowl game in Arizona in the Phoenix area called the Fiesta Bowl, which would be formed a little bit later. 1970 was basically the last straw, as the WAC champion Arizona State, who was undefeated that year, thought they could at least get a major bowl bid. It didn't happen, as the Peach Bowl invited Arizona State, and Arizona State couldn't get a major bowl bid from any other, could not get a major bowl bid, so they had to settle for the less prestigious Peach Bowl in Atlanta. So, 1971, thanks to the Western Athletic Conference, the state of Arizona, thanks in part also to Arizona State University president in the late 60s, we all know this name, G. Homer Durham. Yeah, I gotta love that name. Thus formed the Fiesta Bowl, which would take place yearly, coincidentally, at the home stadium of Arizona State, that's Sun Devil Stadium in Tempe, which back then seated just over 50,000 fans. In fact, the first ever Fiesta Bowl took place late December 1971, when WAC champions Arizona State would play a top 20 team in Florida State, and this was before the Bobby Bowden era. That tells you a little bit about the Fiesta Bowl. But anyway, the game would be decided at the very end with Arizona State scoring a late touchdown to win. The quarterback of that Arizona State team, Dallas Cowboy fans, was Danny White. Yeah, a little history lesson for you. Now, a few years later, 1975 saw a big matchup in the Fiesta between the WAC champions and undefeated Arizona State. They would play a top 5 team in Nebraska. Arizona State won in a defensive fought game. Arizona State finished number 2 in the country that year. Who finished number 1? The Oklahoma Sooners in both the AP and the UPI polls. But Arizona State did get some consolation from at least one publication. The Sporting News magazine declared Arizona State its national champion that year. Now, speaking of Oklahoma, the Sooners would make their Fiesta Bowl debut the following season, 1976, when they would beat WAC champions Wyoming. That's right, from 71 all the way to about 77, the WAC champion got the automatic bid to go to the Fiesta Bowl. But that would soon change, because Arizona and Arizona State accepted bids from the then Pac-8 conference, thus forming the Pac-10. At that point, the WAC ended its automatic bid affiliation with the Fiesta Bowl, so the Fiesta obviously would involve at-large teams. Now, the Fiesta Bowl in the early 80s would really take off and fly. 1981 season, 1982, the game moved to New Year's Day, with the other major bowl games, at that time the Cotton, the Rose, the Sugar, and the Orange. So you had your 5 bowl games that day, and the first New Year's Day Fiesta Bowl took place in January of '82, and it also featured its first ever Heisman Trophy winner in Marcus Allen of USC, but Penn State had the better day. They won the game. The following year, 1982, the Oklahoma Sooners would make a return trip to the Fiesta Bowl for the first time in 6 seasons behind freshman sensation running back Marcus Dupree. They would play Arizona State, who had the #1 defense in the country that year. Dupree shredded them up, running for over 200 yards, but had to leave the game early in the third quarter due to injury. Imagine if he had remained in the game and been healthy, might have gained about 400 yards on the ground. But Arizona State came back in the second half to win. But of course, the game will be more remembered for what happened afterwards than during, in spite of the fact that Dupree was named the offensive MVP of the ballgame. The defensive player of the game, by the way, was Jim Jeffcoat of Arizona State. After the game, Barry Switzer said that Dupree looked slow and overweight, or slower and overweight. Naturally, that would begin a chain reaction of troubles between Dupree, Switzer, and the Oklahoma program. Later that year, of course, Dupree would leave Oklahoma and never come back. The Fiesta Bowl's probably defining moment took place during the '86 season. That year, Miami was #1 in the country, undefeated. They had beaten their toughest competition in former #1 and defending national champion at that time, Oklahoma. Penn State had the fantastic defense, All-American linebacker Shane Conlon. What made this a unique story was that Miami and Penn State at that time were not a part of any conference. They were both independents, both undefeated, both 1-2 in the country. So the major bowls couldn't have them because the major bowls had obligations with major conferences. So it was between the Fiesta Bowl and the Tangerine Bowl in Orlando as far as who could submit the higher bid to potentially get the Hurricanes and Nittany Lions in their bowl game. Well, the Fiesta Bowl made the higher bid and would land the game. Even more good news for the Fiesta, a move that would pay off big time. The Fiesta Bowl, for the first time ever, moved its game to January 2nd so that it could be the only game on that day, and they moved it to primetime television. It was one of the more ingenious moves ever because the game between Miami and Penn State, January 2nd, 1987, generated a rating of over 25. Still to this day, the highest rated college football game of all time. Heisman Trophy winner Vinny Testaverde looked like a bumbling Clark Kent that day, throwing for 6 interceptions, and Penn State upset Miami 14-10 to win the national championship. And then 2 years later, the Fiesta Bowl would again decide a national championship when #1 and undefeated Notre Dame and #3 and undefeated West Virginia, both were independents at the time, would meet in the Fiesta Bowl. It was supposed to have been a battle of terrific quarterbacks in Tony Rice of Notre Dame and Major Harris of West Virginia. Well, Harris that day looked like he didn't even show up because Tony Rice, Rakib Ishmael, and company from Notre Dame would win the game and would win the school's 8th and most recent national championship behind head coach Lou Holtz. So as you can tell in the 80s, the Fiesta Bowl was big time. However, in the early 90s, through no fault of its own, the game had a bit of a black cloud. You see, at this time, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s holiday was not recognized in the state of Arizona. Only one of 2 states, New Hampshire, the other, at that time did not honor the Holiday Bowl. Not the Holiday Bowl, but the Fiesta Bowl. They didn't honor the Martin Luther King holiday. So, in 1990, there were quite a few teams that said that if they received a Fiesta Bowl invitation, they would reject it because the state of Arizona would not recognize Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday. So, 2 teams that did accept bids, through some controversy of course, Louisville and Alabama. It was all Louisville that day. They won the game in a blowout, and Louisville finished that year 11-1. And Louisville's head coach, Oklahoma fans should know this, Howard Schnellenberger. So that was probably the most down moment for the Fiesta Bowl. And again, it was strictly political, really had nothing to do with the game, but of course the state where the game was played. But better days would be ahead for the Fiesta, and it really became a major bowl game just a few years later in 1995 when it would be involved in what was called the Bowl Alliance. This would basically allow champions from the Big 8 Conference, the Southwest Conference, or the Southeast Conference, if they were ranked #1 or 2 in the country, to get out of their bowl tie-in game and play another number 1 and number 2 team, so long as they weren't from the Big Ten or Pac-10 conference, since they had tie-ins with the Rose Bowl to meet for the national championship. This bowl alliance would feature 3 particular bowl games who would rotate the number 1 versus number 2 team in the country for the national championship from 95 all the way to 97. The Fiesta Bowl got to host the first ever Bowl Alliance championship with number 1 Nebraska, who would have had to go to the Orange Bowl before this Bowl Coalition Bowl Alliance, and number 2 Florida, who would have had to have gone to the Sugar Bowl. They were champions of the SEC. So number 1 versus number 2 got out of their bowl deals to meet in the Fiesta Bowl, and Nebraska absolutely tore Florida apart that day. A 29-point second quarter will help you win a game, and that's what Nebraska had. That 95 team, by the way, from Nebraska is considered by some to be the best team in the history of college football, the 95 Huskers. In 1998, the bowl system that we go by now for major bowls, the BCS, would be formed. This would allow the Big Ten and the Pac-10 champions to get out or tie in with the Rose Bowl if they had the number 1 or number 2 team in the country. In 1998, the first ever BCS National Championship game would be played in Tempe, Arizona at Sun Devil Stadium, the Fiesta Bowl, and that day Tennessee beat Florida State. 4 years later, the BCS National Championship game would make a return to the Fiesta Bowl, and it would be no question the top 2 teams in the country, the only 2 major undefeateds at the time, defending national champion and number 1 Miami against number 2 and undefeated Ohio State. The game itself controversial because it went to overtime, but the controversial part was in OT with Miami holding on to a 7-point lead. Ohio State on 4th down, incomplete pass, but a late flag for pass interference kept the game going. Ohio State would eventually score a touchdown in the first overtime, and then the second overtime would score a touchdown and then hold off Miami, and Ohio State won the game and the national title. And you can ask any Miami fan to this day, they're going to tell you they got ripped off. And then 2006, the BCS changed things up again. In addition to the Fiesta Bowl, the Orange, the Rose, and the Sugar, a 5th game would be added, which would be called the BCS National Championship game. And that year, Tempe, Arizona, or in this case, Glendale, Arizona, would host the Fiesta Bowl for the first time. The Sun Devil Stadium in Tempe was basically in need of a facelift, and there was a new stadium at that time in the greater Phoenix area called the University of Phoenix Stadium, which was at that time the most revolutionary stadium in the country. Of course, that'd be surpassed later by Cowboy Stadium in Arlington. And that year, Glendale would host 2 major games. It would host the Fiesta Bowl, which would feature Oklahoma against Boise State. Some people still to this day call it the greatest college football game ever, with Boise State, the underdogs, upsetting Oklahoma thanks to a good start in the game, and then thanks to some trick plays at the end. The Broncos beat the Sooners in overtime to win the Fiesta Bowl. Just a week later, the national championship game, also from that same stadium, would see Florida upset Ohio State. And then the following year, the Sooners would return to the Fiesta Bowl after winning the Big 12, as from 2006 onward, the Fiesta Bowl made it clear that the Big 12 champion would go to the Fiesta Bowl against an at-large team. Well, Oklahoma, again, was favored to win the Fiesta, but would lose to West Virginia by giving up nearly 350 yards rushing against the Mountaineers. No Sooner defense in any game has given up more yards rushing before or since. So, there you have it. There's a bit of history as far as the Fiesta Bowl. Again, it wasn't a major bowl game in its infancy, but as you can tell throughout the years, it attracted the big matchups, and it weathered a lot of controversy off the field because of the Dr. Martin Luther King holiday. By the way, if you're curious, it would be in 1995 that Arizona would finally make Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday official for that state. And that right there is a history lesson for you. Not just football, but also as far as government goes. Oklahoma in the Fiesta Bowl, they've lost their last 3 trips in the Fiesta. Hopefully they can get it snapped, and if you believe the odds makers, they'll do that because they're favored to beat Connecticut by 17 points. Thanks for watching, and big congratulations, by the way, to Ryan Broyles as well as to Quentin Carter, as they were named All-American by the Associated Press. And by the way, Jeremy Beal, second-team All-American. Those guys had fantastic years. And if you haven't heard, I'm sure you already have by now, it's old news, but Kevin Wilson, head coach at the University of Indiana. By the way, he will be on the coaching staff for this upcoming Fiesta Bowl, but he'll be there to basically to coach offensive positions. Josh Heupel and Jay Norvell are now co-offensive coordinators, with Heupel as the play caller, effective this upcoming bowl game. Coming up sometime during the week, ending January 1st, we will have the bowl matchup show between the Sooners and the Huskies. Boomer Sooner.